Good morning, everyone. We're starting today the portion of Behar-Bechukotai. It's two portions combined in the last portions of the book of Leviticus, Vayikra. As we're starting from the book called Selections from Likutei Sichos, we're going to be studying the first one for Behar. So a short introduction. In this week's Torah portion on chapter 25, verse 35, 36, 37, 38 is talking about charging interest for a loan, which is forbidden. With a little caveat, it's forbidden for a fellow Jew, but not for a Gentile. So I want to read the text, explain it, and then see what the Rabbi has to say. If your fellow among you becomes needy and his hand is wavering, you should support him before he becomes completely destitute, so that he can live with you. Even if he is a convert or a resident non-Jewish alien, provided he is not an idol worshiper, you should not take interest from him, for taking interest is a double sin. While this may be difficult for you, you should fear your God and help your fellow to live with you. You should not lend them your money with interest, nor should you lend your food with interest. I am God, your God, who took you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be the God to you. And that's the end of this topic. So to summarize, the Torah restricts us from lending money and charging interest or any food. That is applied everywhere at any time. When we lend money, we must lend it without charging any interest. In fact, in every Jewish community, they have an established free interest loan society where they assist members of the community with a short-term loan without charging interest. And this is, but God completes this sentence by saying, I am the God who took you out of Egypt to be my people. And the question is what? Why is it for? What for? Now let's read it in the Rebbe. The following is a question that the Rebbe will addresses that many other commentators ask, but the Rebbe, based on Kabbalah, is the only way to explain to give a good answer. This week's Torah reading includes the prohibition against giving or taking interest. In fact, the sin is on both parties and any witness, any party to a loan exchange that involves interest is totally forbidden. So the lender is punished, the borrower is punished, the witnesses, the scribe who writes the contract, anyone involved with a loan that was given with interest is going to be severely punished. Page 431. The passage concludes, I'm God your Lord, who took you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. Sifra is an early commentary prior to the Talmud comments. From this verse, our sages derived the principle that whoever accepts the yoke of the prohibition against charging interest accepts the yoke of heaven. Whoever casts off the yoke of forbidden interest casts off the yoke of heaven. Whoever acknowledges the mitzvah of interest acknowledges the exodus from Egypt. Whoever denies the mitzvah of interest is as if he denies the exodus from Egypt. Sifra tells us very simple. You want to accept God's yoke? Accept upon yourself to lend money without interest. Anyone that is lending money in interest is removing God's yoke, meaning God's sovereignty, God's rulings of the universe. If you want to believe, accept the fact that God has took us out of Egypt, you must adhere to the rules of not charging interest. Anyone who violates this law is considered as if he does not believe in the fact that God took us out of Egypt. As the text ends regarding this commandment, I am God who took you out of Egypt. We must understand Why is the prohibition against interest more closely related to the exodus from Egypt and the acceptance of the yoke of heaven than other mitzvot? Based on the Talmud, Rashi explains. So that's the first question that I was asking, a simple question. God gave us other commandments, and we don't say if you keep kosher, you accept God's yoke. If you don't keep kosher, you reject God's yoke. If you keep kosher, you accept God took us out of Egypt. If you reject it, you don't. It doesn't apply to kosher. It doesn't apply to Shabbat. It doesn't apply to honor your father and mother. It doesn't apply to tithe. It doesn't apply to appointing a king. It's only said regarding interest. So Rashi, the commentator, had this problem, and Rashi explains that at the time of the Exodus, God differentiated between the firstborn and all others. So too, he is able to identify and will hold accountable a Jew who lends money to his fellow Jew with interest and claims that the money belongs to a non-Jew. By the way, anytime I say a non-Jew, we're dealing with idol worshiper, not a non-Jew that is not an idol worshiper. A non-Jew that is not an idol worshiper is just the same as the Jew, as we just read in the text, that a person who lives among you who is not Jewish, but accepted upon himself not to worship idols, are treated like a Jewish person. So we're talking about idol worshippers. So when I say a non-Jew, I'm referring to an idol worshiper. Rashi says that there was a selection in the land of Egypt when God killed all firstborn. God says, I will pass by at night and I will kill or smite all firstborn Egyptians, but the firstborn Jewish people I will let live. In other words, God was able to pick and choose whom he is going to save, who is going to let die. The same is interest. Some Jewish people want to make money off their money. So what do? They go and they say to a friend, you need money? I can lend it to you, but this money is not mine. It's a deposit from a non-Jew. And if it's a deposit from a non-Jew, I'm allowed to charge interest because it's not me who is making the money, it's the non-Jew. By doing so, what he does is hiding the fact that he is the owner of the money and he's violating a law. That's why God says, I took you out of Egypt, because I know which child who was born to a Jew, which one was born to an Egyptian. I also know where the money came from. Even though you're hiding the tracks or the source of the money, I will be able to tell if it's really belonged to a non-Jew or not. And if you're charging interest and cheating the borrower, you are actually denying the fact that I took you out of Egypt. Because if you accept that I took out the Jewish people from Egypt, you know that I know exactly the truth. Is that clear? Not so complicated. Very good. Says the Rebbe, this insight, however, relates only to one specific circumstance regarding the prohibition against interest. Lending with interest while claiming that the money belongs to a non-Jew. Says the Rebbe, I don't understand. God says, I took you out of Egypt to tell you that if you adhere to the law of interest, no charging interest to a loan, then you accept that I took you out of Egypt. But the explanation Rashi brings is only in a case when someone decided to say that the money belongs to a non-Jew. Lending with interest while claiming that the money belongs to a non-Jew. Moreover, even in that instance, it does not apply when the lender makes that statement to mislead a human being. That is, if the borrower knew that the money belonged to a Jew, he would not accept the loan, or the court would not allow the loan to be extended. It is applicable only when the lender states that the money belongs to a non-Jew, thinking that God will not make a distinction and recognize that the money belongs to him. As such, he denies the Exodus at which time God has made such a distinction. The Rebbe says, I don't understand. In that case, somebody tells you, I need to charge you interest because it's not my money, it belongs to a non-Jew. Who is the one who commits the crime? The lender. The borrower is not committing a sin. The court is not committing a sin. The witnesses are not committing a sin. Only the lender. But God, when he says, I took you out of Egypt, it applies that we need to adhere to the law, because someone who adheres to the law accepts that God took us out of Egypt. It applies to the lender, the borrower, the court, and the witnesses. And the only explanation that's given that a man is hiding the identity of the money, the source of the money, is only applicable to the lender, not to the rest of the other parties. So that's the first question that Rabbi is having. However, this does not explain the connection between the prohibition against interest and the Exodus as a whole, nor the connection between interest and the denial of the yoke of heaven. Then there is another point. It says, the beginning of the statement is, anyone who follows adhere to the laws of loan-free, interest-free, is accepting God's yoke. What is so unique about this mitzvah that we say God's yoke is attached to it? There are commentators who explain that by lending money to a fellow Jew without interest and without seeking to make a profit, a Jew demonstrates his trust in God and his acceptance of the yoke of heaven. He willingly fulfills the command to help a Jew without profiting thereby. By contrast, when a person lends money at interest, he shows that he does not place his trust in God and thus casts off the yoke of heaven. Some explain the following. They say, you know what, if you trust God, then you got to help a fellow. We're dealing with someone who is bound money, not to start a business, but for livelihood, or to start a business so he can support his family, not a venture, an investment for a rainy day. So if someone is in a point that he needs money to make a living and he needs to borrow money to buy tools so he can go and start a business, if you help him with interest, it means you do not trust that God will provide you with your means. Because if you trust God is going to help you, why do you need to charge him interest for helping him? You should help him without charging him. The fact that you charge somebody for helping him, it demonstrates that you do not accept God's yoke. Because God's yoke, meaning God will provide, God will take care of your needs. Nevertheless, this interpretation requires much clarification. The Rebbe says that doesn't make sense either. A, it places the emphasis on the person's trust in God or lack of it, and not on his acceptance or rejection of the yoke of heaven. Says the Rebbe, there is the major distinction between God's yoke versus trust in God. The issue of lending in interest and not accepting that God, or not believing or trusting that God will provide, is a lack of God's trust, not God's yoke. You can have God's yoke and not trust God. Trust of God is when you need to, when you are lending someone money and you're not charging interest because you see he's in a needy situation. It means you trust in God. If you charge interest, you don't trust God. But it's nothing to do with God's yoke. B, this trust or lack of trust is not directly connected with the question of interest, but rather with the mitzvah of performing deeds of kindness. Before mentioning the prohibition against taking interest, the Torah states, when your brother will become impoverished, you should support him. This implies that one should lend him money without gaining a profit. Says the Rebbe, if it's about helping someone, it's not about interest. It's about the mitzvah to support the poor. There is a mitzvah right before this. There is another text in this week's portion, just a few verses before, that if you see someone in need, you're not allowed to keep a blind eye. You must be there for the person and assist them. You can assist them with financial benefit. You can assist them with finding them a job. You can assist them with inviting them over or giving them some food. You must look after the poor. So when it comes to interest, this is a whole different ballgame. If the idea that the man is not trusting God because he don't care to help a poor man, it is already included in a previous mitzvah. It has nothing to do with interest. So therefore, the Rebbe says, to summarize, the Torah tells us that we should not lend money with interest, and the Sifra, the Medrash, tells us anyone who lends with interest denies God's yoke and does not believe in the exodus from Egypt. And Rashi explains one way, it refers to someone who is hiding the source of the money, and he says it belongs to a non-Jew. Says the Rebbe, that's one scenario, but it does not include all parties, and it doesn't include majority of the cases. Number two, this says the Rebbe, what does yoke of heaven has to do with charging interest in particular? Because if it's about supporting the poor, it's about trusting God and not about yoke of heaven. In addition, says the Rebbe, prior to this law, God commanded us to support the poor. So we have a mitzvah. Someone who charged with interest is not demonstrating this supporting the poor. So he's not violating loan commandment. He's violating the mitzvah to help everybody else. I hope I'm not going too far on a limb here. Is everybody understanding what I'm talking about? Okay. I am going to, okay, let's continue reading. Chassidut explain. Chassidut is the interpretation of Kabbalah, a fundamental principle. Accepting God's yoke as expressed by the observance of the mitzvot implies more than submission to God's will. It involves a proactive willingness to participate in his service. And that calls forth a similar response from above. Let me explain. The Rebbe is about to explain to us that whenever we perform God's commandments, it's not just accepting God's yoke and obeying God, but also calling for God to act in the same way. It's just like a mirror. We, as human beings, the Jewish people, are a mirror of God. So whatever we do or don't do is a mirror of what God does and don't do. And here is how I explain that. God takes an active role in a Jew's divine service. This is expressed by the well-known interpretation of the blessing recited before fulfilling a mitzvah. Every time before you do a mitzvah, you say the following blessing. When you praise God, we say, who sanctified us with his commandment, not with commandments, with our commandment, but with his commandments. Asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav. B'mitzvotav meaning with God's commandments. That is, as is well known, the mitzvot we observe are his mitzvahs. He also fulfills them. When we thank God for sanctifying us, we thank God for sanctifying us with his commandments. His commandment, not the commandments he commanded us, but commandments that he fulfills. And he was kind enough to share them with us. So when God says, put on tefillin for men, when God says, light Shabbat candles for women, when God says, eat matzah, when God says, stay away from consuming blood, he himself follows the same way. Only because God follows those rules, he gave them to us. The only difference is God is not necessarily limited to a physical universe or material universe, so it's in a spiritual sense. And in addition, God knows the reason for it, we don't. And that's where the challenge is. But whenever I fulfill a mitzvah of studying Torah or praying to God, God does exactly the same. It is a mirror reflecting God's behavior. That's why before we study Torah, we have a mitzvah for studying Torah. Before we eat, we have a blessing for washing hands. We have a blessing for breaking bread. We have a blessing for eating fruit. We have a blessing for drinking wine. We have a blessing for circumcision. We have a blessing for marriage. All that we say in all the commandments. Kiddushanu means sanctify us, made us holy. B'mitzvotav, with his commandments, with his behavior, because it's a mirror and a reflection of the way God behaved. That's the introduction to explain we're going to get there. That is, as is well known, the mitzvot we observe are his mitzvot. He also fulfills them. And there are two dimensions to this dynamic. There are two ways to explain how God fulfills the commandments to reflect the mitzvot, the commandments he gave us. A, God fulfills the mitzvot before the Jewish people, as reflected in our sages' statement, what he does, he commands Israel to do. One way to explain it is God follows the commandments. Because he follows them, he gave them to us. And therefore we say whatever he does, he commands us to do. In other words, who's the first one to fulfill the commandments? God himself. B, he observes the mitzvot in response to the observance of the mitzvot by the Jewish people. As reflected in our sage's statement, whenever a person studies the Torah, the Holy One, blessed be, he studies opposite him. This applies not only regarding Torah study, but also to the observance of other mitzvot. Our sages tell us that any time we perform a mitzvah, God is right next to us and perform the same mitzvah. That's why when we study Torah, when we pray, we ask God to cure people, we ask God for blessings. Why? Because God is near. God is here. So according to this explanation, when I make a bracha on this drink, God is sitting here and reciting the same blessing. The question is, who's the one who did it first? According to this explanation, the Jew performed the mitzvah first, and God is just mirrors or a shadow that does the exact same way in return. The first way is the opposite. God performed the mitzvot before because he loved us so much, he wanted us to copy him, so he gave them to us. The other explanation is that God is following our behavior. So because he's very kind to us, he gave us the commandments, and every time we perform a deed, a good deed, he in returns does the same. Now the Rebbe will explain the difference between the two. We are on page 434. Of course, the fact that our deeds prompt God to fulfill the mitzvot is no indication that we are independently capable of causing God to act, because there is no comparison between our fulfillment of the mitzvot and his. After all, a created being is utterly uncomparable to the Creator. Rather, this process is causation is possible only because God desires that our deeds influences him, so to speak. The Rabbi is saying that the fact that God is doing the same that we do is not because we force him, but that's the way, a system that God created, he desired that. This requires explanation. Right. This requires explanation. Why indeed does God want the divine service of mere mortals to exert influence in the spiritual realms, despite there being no comparison between them and him? The first phase of the dynamic that his observance of the mitzvot bring about our observance can be understood. His deeds generate the potential for us to fulfill the mitzvot. But what is the explanation for the second phase, that our observance prompts us? The Rabbi is asking, the first explanation is God studied Torah, God celebrates Passover, God celebrates Sukkot, God keeps kosher, God stay away from lying in a spiritual sense. And therefore, he was kind enough to share with us the same behavior in this physical material universe. That makes sense. But the second way that we create action on God's behalf, when I study Torah, God sits and studies Torah. When I celebrate Passover, I celebrate Chabad, God does the same. How is it possible? Why is it? It must be that God desired that. Why is God willing to act or behave according to our behavior? In other words, we cause God to do or not do something. And to understand the above, several basic questions must first be answered. The Rabbi says, let's start addressing other questions. I'm going to share with you very, very simple, very abbreviated, so we can get to, you know what, we can read it. To understand the above, several basic questions must be answered. Why is divine service necessary at all? Why not let God provide us with everything through an arousal from above, as a reflection of his beneficence? So says the Rebbe, God is very kind. We are told God is our Father, Heavenly Father that loves us. If he loves us, why does he need us to study Torah and to observe the mitzvot? For us to gain reward? God can give us all that we want. Just like a father is buying his son at the age of 16 or 14, he buys him a car, and he buys them tuition for college. He does for him everything he needs. Why should God demand that we do mitzvot before he rewards us? That's the first question. As is well known, the world was created because of the divine initiative to act benevolently to his created beings. The reason God created the universe is because he wanted to express kindness. And in order for God to create kindness, he had to create creatures who are reflecting God, a reflection of God, who have a free choice. And therefore, God created us so he can be kind to us, so he can express his kindness to us. Since God is the ultimate good, and it is the nature of a benevolent to act kindly, why shouldn't he grant his creations, everything they need without his benevolence being dependent on their service? So why do you need the commandments? Why God wanted us to serve God? In response, Chassidut explained, there are several answers to the question. Here is the Chassidic answer, that the ultimate expression of kindness is to have the recipient earn the good which he receives. A gift dispensed gratis without the recipient having earned it is regarded as bread of shame. Since it is the nature of the benevolent to act kindly, God desires to give the Jewish people the ultimate good. Therefore, he structured the world in such a manner that they earn divine influence. Did everybody understand what we just said? Let me summarize. A true kindness is not a gift. A gift, we call it, is bread of shame. When I receive a gift without putting an investment and earning it, it's an embarrassment. It doesn't satiate our body properly. But what if I go to work and I work very hard and I earn a living and I'm successful? One person is more successful, the other is less. But with the money earned, we went and bought bread or flour and we needed bread. Then we enjoy every bite of the bread. Why? Because our effort and toil is invested. As the Mishnah tells us, that a person would rather to have one measure of his own efforts than 9 of others, even if the quality is greater, the taste is better, it doesn't matter. If I grow it in my garden and I nurture it and I care for it, I would benefit from it. Not just the way I think or what I talk myself into. The body will derive greater benefit from something that I invested in and worked on. And that's why God gave us the commandments. God doesn't need me to keep kosher for any benefit. God doesn't need me to stay away from blood for any benefit. God wants to give us an opportunity to earn. So he set us a measure, so to say, boundaries. He set requirements, and he says, go ahead. If you follow the requirements and if you stay away from the negative behavior, you will earn a great reward. So then we deserve that reward because we earn that with sweat and tears. We put a lot of effort. And that's why God is so benevolent and kind. He created those restrictions and those laws to allow us to benefit in a deeper, real, true sense of benefit. On this basis, we can appreciate why the Jews' divine service impact the spiritual realms above. Were a person to receive payment for work which did not benefit his employer, the payment would be tainted. It would still be considered bread of shame. When the recipient knows that the work for which he is being paid is of no consequence, he feels that he does not deserve any reward. He has not truly earned it. If you go to work and you do a lot of work, and at the end of the day, the employer tells you there was no use for it. You know, you dug holes, you put the measurements, you're about to build a structure, and then they decide to build the structure at a factory and deliver it. Now, everything you invested is of no use. Even though you're going to get a pay for that, the true satisfaction of something I invested in and I can enjoy is not going to be there. And therefore, in order for us to truly enjoy our toil and sweat and hard work, is when God himself is, so to say, reflecting exactly what we do. or that God did the same commandments before he gave them to us. This way, we know we affect God, because if I do it, God does it. If I don't do it, God doesn't do it. If I transgress a sin, I remove God from me. In other words, my behavior affects God directly. And now we can enjoy when we did the right thing and we connected with God. We are very happy because we know God acted in a positive way. For this reason, God structured existence in such a way that the divine service of the Jewish people has no effect in the spiritual realm. Has an effect in the spiritual realms, bringing about a spiritual equivalent to the mitzvot performed on earth. Consequently, the reward Jews receive is not bread of shame, but payment received for doing something of value to God, recompense well earned for their service. Says the Rebbe, when you do something good, you bring God to the universe. You bring God to the universe, there's a blessing around. There's more rain. There is less trouble, less calamities. What happens is you impact the universe. You impact your surrounding, you impact God. And therefore, God in return is giving us a reward, a gift that we fully deserve. And that's why God will reflect exactly what we do. There is another dimension to this. Yeah, we're going to skip that. I'm going to just summarize. He says that the Tsar ordered one of his servants to the palace, and he told them, I want you to go work for me for pay. Are you willing? And the man, who was a professional farmer, very, very good farmer, said, sure, I'll do it. And the Tsar says, I'm sitting here in front of me. I want you to take a sickle that you chop the wheat of the field, the harvest. Start doing it and imagine as if there is wheat growing here in the room in my palace. And the man said, are you sure? He said, yeah, do it. You got, how much you making an hour? $59? I'll give you $60 an hour. The guy started and went on for half an hour, 2 hours. After 2 hours, he turned to the Tsar, had the chance of losing his life. I can't do it. And the Tsar said, why? And he says, because I don't see the results of my labor. If I constantly, when I walk in the field, I move ahead. I look back and I see how much I did. Now I just did it in the air. I can't do it. And the previous Rebbe used it as an example. He says, when God gives us commandments, and he says, keep kosher, celebrate Shabbat, be kind to one another, pray to God. If you do it and you don't see that there are consequences, it doesn't affect anything, there is a limit to how much you can do it. But when you are told that every time you do it, God sits next to you and watches and does the same, now it helps us do and fight and overcome challenges, because we know that it affects God. Because in the reverse, if we misbehave, God distances himself from us. And again, it's the same point that we are the center of the creation and we are godlike. And when we do the right thing, God does the right thing. When we do God's commandments, God fulfills those commandments as well. Either God, because he did the commandments before, and therefore he assigned them to us, but which is wonderful, or even when God will fulfill the commandments as a result of our behavior, because God wants us to, earn it with not getting a gift, but after sweat and hard work, or so that there is a meaning to what we do, and it's not just like the servant waving the sickle in the palace and unable to do it for a long time. Now we can explain the idea of interest. The rabbi, I'm going to show it you an introduction. The rabbi tells us that charging interest is not a simple one of the 613 commandments, but a major commandment. And it is a general relationship between us and God and understanding the relationship. Here it is. Taking God as a partner. Number 5. All the divine influence felt in this world depends on the divine service of the Jewish people. The Torah tells us that when we behave, that's next week's portion, but it's this week's portion, the second portion. Bechukotai, God says, if you follow my way, rain will follow, the dew will bless the field. If you disbehave, it will be a drought. This is in this week's portion. So our behavior, our service of God affects the entire universe. And the entire universe actually look at us as responsible. Every time there is a mess, they blame the Jewish people. Every mitzvah has a unique impact. For the expression of a particular mitzvah in the spiritual realm is dependent on the fulfillment of that mitzvah by the Jewish people. The same is true in a more general sense. The very fact that the divine service of the Jewish people has an effect on the spiritual realms is also a function of the divine service, and in particular is reflected in the divine service involved in the observance of the mitzvah prohibition of interest. What the Rabbi is saying, each mitzvah is one detail, one particular way that affects the universe in a certain way. But there are mitzvot that affects the universe in a greater way, and one of them is the interest, charging interest for a loan. Here is how the Rebbe explains it. What is interest? Receiving profit for lending money, right? What is interest? As long as my money is in your pocket, you pay for it. My money works for me when it's in your pocket or in your or in your car or in your tools or in your business, whatever it is. So the money, if it stays with you one day, you pay me 10 cents. If it stays 10 days, you pay me $1. To 11 days, $1.10. The longer it stays, meaning that the money continuously bringing you benefit while it is in your pocket. The lender derives a gain because the money lent once belonged to him and is still making profit for something that was something of a long time ago. Here is what the Rabbi explained. True, presently the money is no longer his. It has now been transferred to the domain of the borrower. Nevertheless, by having lent the borrower his money, the lender enables the borrower to do business, and in the lender's mind, that is a reason enough for the borrower to pay him interest. Thus, what the Rabbi is saying is, when I took $100 bill and I lent it to you, now the money is not mine anymore. You owe me money, but the $100 that I lent you is not mine. When I charge you interest, I'm trying to get money, to gain from something that's not mine anymore. And that is very prohibited because it will affect the relationship between us and God, as we just discovered before. So before we get there, again, lending money in interest is accepting that I'm going to make a profit from something that's not mine any longer. If I sold you my car, by the way, if I rent you my car, I can charge interest. If I rent to you my book, I can charge interest. Not interest, I can charge a fee. It's not interest. So I tell you, you know what? You need to buy, you want to use this book? I charge 10 cents a day for that. That's not charging interest, that's rent. And that's acceptable. There is no issue. The only exception is money. I cannot rent money. And the reason is the book, when I rent it to you, it's the same book that's coming back to me. You cannot replenish this book, replace this book with another book. That's called violation of the terms. That's called cheating. Because if I rent it to you, if I rent you the table, I can rent you the table for a day, charge you $1 for the rent. You cannot supply me with another table. If it's done, if you do it, it has to be part of the agreement. Or you have to replace it only in case it got damaged or got destroyed. When it comes to money, you are not going to get the same bill back. The idea of lending the money is giving it away and it's not mine anymore. What's left is debt. The person who borrowed the money owes me that value. He is going to pay me not the same bill. He's going to give me a different bill. It's the idea from when we started it. And therefore, when I charge interest, I'm charging interest on something that's no longer in my possession. It's not mine. Therefore, this is prohibited. That's why the Torah prohibits it. So we're going to continue here. Thus, observing the prohibition against interest means taking profit only for money that is presently still in the lenders. This is also the dynamic underlying a heter iska, a financial arrangement where a certain portion of the loan is considered an investment, allowing the lender or the investor to the opportunity to receive a guaranteed return from his money. In a heter iska, a certain portion of the money that changed hands remains the lender's. It is merely entrusted to the borrower. Thus, when the borrower does business with the funds, he is also doing business with a share belonging to the lender, and the profit the lender receives is thus earned solely from the money which actually still belongs to him. Similarly, similar principles apply with regards to the renting of animals or utensils. Let me just explain what the rabbi says. When it comes to lending with interest, there is a heter iska. Heter iska meaning it's a contract that the rabbi facilitate, where the lender and the borrower sign an agreement that the money is not going to be a loan, but also a partnership in the business. By the way, it only applies only if you borrow money for investing in a business, not to feed your family. That does not apply. So, for example, if I want to start a business and I need to borrow to rent a store or to buy equipment, I want to sell stickers and I need a printer that costs $10,000. And I come to you and says, lend me $10,000, and for that I'll give you a 10% share of the company. That is not charging interest, because what we agreed is that a share of the money, a part of the money equal to the 10% income is still mine. So it's my money. I didn't give it away. By the way, what's worth to notice, if the business went down under and it died, then that value of money, the borrower don't have to pay back, because it wasn't his money to begin with. It belongs to the investor. The investor has lost the same as the borrower. But we're not going to get into it. We're going to go back to interest. A Jew's conduct towards a fellow Jew is mirrored in how God conducts himself towards him. If a Jew transgresses the prohibition against interest, that is, if he presently makes a profit only because he lent his fellow Jew money previously, a similar pattern is followed by God in relations to him. There is no present and active investment from above in his divine service. We said that God is constantly sitting in front of us and is mirroring what we do, either because what he did he gave us, or because he wants us not to have a free bread, a bread of shame. But what if I myself lend somebody the money and I expect that money that is not mine anymore to bring me benefit? It evokes or awaken God's, so to say, action in the exact opposite. God said, you know what? I'm going to reverse that. I am sitting presently and following you behavior. I do the same. I'm going to stop doing it. I'm going to walk away, because the money that wasn't used is giving you benefit. Now what you do presently for my service is not going to be here. It's going to be gone. And let's see how it works. I'm reading again. A Jew's conduct towards a fellow Jew is mirrored in how God conducts himself towards him. If a Jew transgresses the prohibition against interest, that is, if he presently make a profit only because he lent his fellow Jew money previously, a similar pattern is followed by God in relation to him. There is no present and active investment from above in his divine service. He is only provided with initial resources, that is, the mitzvot are fulfilled in the spiritual realm before he begins his divine service, endow him with power to carry out his service. But he is given no more than that. The second dimension mentioned previously, that God sits and study opposite him, divine energy elicited through a man's observance is lacking. By contrast, when a person observes the prohibition against interest, God mirrors his actions, investing and partnering with him. Not only does he endow the person with potential before he begins his divine service, but God remains an active partner in his present spiritual endeavors. The Holy One, blessed be he, studies opposite him. In this matter, a Jew's divine service has an effect above, eliciting God's investment in his effort. On this basis, we can appreciate the connection between the prohibition against interest and the acceptance of the yoke of heaven and the exodus from Egypt. The prohibition against interest is of all-embracing significance. Its observance calls forth God's active partnership in an divine service, a response to man's proactive acceptance of God's yoke expressed through the fulfillment of mitzvot. And by establishing such a connection with God, a person is granted divine influence that enables them to transcend all limitations, the spiritual counterpart of the exodus from Egypt. What the rabbi is saying is Egypt in Hebrew, it means constraints, limitations. If you lend someone without interest, what you do is you accept God's yoke, meaning God says, money is yours, benefit from it. Money is not yours. Don't take money for it because it's not your money anymore. By doing so, God is very pleased, and he's sitting next to us, and he continues blessing us and reflecting what we do in the way we do. In other words, all boundaries and all limitations are removed. What happens if someone does charge interest? He's taking benefit for something that used to be his and not any longer his. God says, if it's so, what I did before, I'm going to stop, and I'm not going to sit next to you in studies and so to say make a reflection of your behavior, and therefore he removes the yoke of heaven from himself. And that's the end of our discussion today. Thank you very much.
Would you say it parallels the discussion